Hello! People seem to have liked the previous video on Soviet economy, strangely enough, and plenty of you guys have sent me this video. Soviet-style economics is insane and here's why. Yes. I'm unfamiliar with the channel, but it seems like they just cover pop geography and economy stuff. Plenty of "why are they so poor" type content that I don't trust the honesty of, kinda how liberals always seem to forget that sanctions exist. I won't judge till I watch them though, they might actually be decent, who knows. Regardless, let's jump right in. I'll of course skip around to only the parts that are of interest, otherwise this video will be like an hour long.
Largely cut off from global economic banking and trade, as well as not being subject to demand shocks, the Soviet Union was a single country that didn't just get through the Great Depression, but thrived. Rather than contracting, the Soviet economy continued its dramatic economic and industrial boom, increasing its total industrial output between 1929 and 1934 by a whopping 50%, all while maintaining effectively zero unemployment. In light of such a major economic downturn in contrast, some Western economists praised the Soviet communist system, with some going as far as to claim its superiority over Western capitalism.
Yes, we'll get into all that. Silly choice of music aside, seriously, no one puts on Sweet Home Alabama or something when people speak of the US, which, I don't know why, such culturally charged music is, yeah, this stuff just gets exhausting after a while. Anyways, it's nice to see that he actually does give some reasonable credit to an economy that basically had all the cards stacked against it. I wonder if he'll undo all that in a minute.
But why? How is the once envied Soviet economy now in ruins, only to have left a bloodied print on human history?
Isn't this guy American? I mean, if you're looking for bloody prints. Alright, after this he gives a semi-decent rundown of the basic pre-industrial era of Russia and parts of Europe, but then he says this.
This happened all over Western Europe, effectively creating a new, more inclusive labor market. Opposite to an extractive economic system, an inclusive one does not rely on the desires of the upper class, but on the equilibrium of markets.
That's just ideology. That's plainly not true. If I'm being very pedantic, yes, pre-capitalist and capitalist formations standardized market function and movement of labor, but to not claim they were extractive is simply wrong. Surplus exists in all economic systems aside from the absolutely earliest formations. And distribution of the surplus is definitely politically determined and extractive, especially under capitalism. Simple base superstructure stuff, really. Furthermore, he's not exactly clear on time frame and location, instead loosely stating, all across Europe after the Black Plague, which is reductive to the point of rendering his point incorrect. The desires of individual members of the upper class don't take absolute predominance, yes, but all society since slave society has fundamentally had a class character and hierarchy. Aside from moments of revolutionary turmoil, serfs, slaves, peasants, etc. usually didn't hold much if any political power, and their economic power was equally negligible. He kind of betrays his ideological presuppositions right away with that sentence.
Therefore, wages cannot be artificially lowered, but rather workers are paid based on their value to their employer.
Wages cannot be artificially lowered, and are paid according to the value to the employers. More nonsense. Again, time and location aren't stated, so it's difficult to really analyze what he means. Nonetheless, regular waged work under feudalism was fairly infrequent, although the world was and still is incredibly diverse. Many East and West Asian, pre-Columbian, and other civilizations had certain instances of regular waged work, but under capitalism, wages can and are artificially lowered all the time. This might be a miscommunication by what he means with artificial, but real wages under capitalism are lowered by things as diverse as inflation, increased rates of exploitation, meaning in the Marxian sense, higher percentages of surplus value extraction, the state of the labor movement, and related methods. Normally though, rather than focusing on pushing down the wage, increasing profits is usually more, well, profitable. That's the first usual push, and we might get into that in just a minute. As for being paid according to the value to the employers, this too is nonsense. Under capitalism, a wage is simply the price of labor power, which is itself a commodity. The same laws that regulate the price of commodities will regulate wages. Wages are, in general, regulated according to the relations between supply and demand, and according to the competition between the capitalists and the workers, that is to say, competition between the buyers of labor power and the sellers of labor power. Wages themselves are determined by the cost of production of labor power. This gets much deeper, but my point is, no one is paid according to whatever abstract notion of worth, quote-unquote, they have. They're paid according to scientifically analyzable patterns in the labor market, conditions of the labor movement, etc., etc. Check out this video for a deeper dive into the subjectivist nonsense. For further reading, take a look at Marx's short essay titled Wage, Labor, and Capital. Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Ground News. Frequently, during the research for my videos, I encounter biased sources that don't publicly state their leanings, or even worse, their funding. This can be very irritating, but not with Ground News. Ground News is the world's first news comparison platform that makes it easy to read between the lines of media bias and break free from algorithms. Their mission is to build media literacy and to fight misinformation. Ground News allows you to spot media bias by giving you a visual breakdown of news sources covering a story and see where they fall on the political spectrum. It allows you to check your blind spots and see which news stories are being underreported. My favorite feature is their global coverage, which allows you to see how international stories are being covered across the globe using an interactive map. Track your reading habits, your potential biases, if sources are factual or not, who owns those sources, and much more with Ground News. Go to my link in the description to try Ground News for free, or subscribe to get access to all the features you see here, and support a small team of independent media outsiders working to make the news more transparent. Big thanks to Ground News for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, so the support is very much appreciated. Alright, back to the video.
This small gain in wealth caused a small gain in power to act and organize in the future. Over time, this compounded until, when the time was right, a broad coalition of workers, soldiers, businessmen, etc. could then rise up to make demands or even remake the system to be more inclusive. When a coalition is sufficiently broad, it makes it so no one single group is able to make a power grab to cement themselves as the new elite, becoming equally as tyrannical as the old ones. Eventually, this led to secure property rights, a crucially important foundational element for the Industrial Revolution.
He's playing very loosey-goosey with his terms here, goddamn. Workers, as in people who sell labor power in return for a wage, are a specific class that didn't attain dominance in numbers in Western Europe until 200 years ago, and globally even more recently than that. Business owners, too, is a silly, unspecific term, but I kinda get that he's intentionally not being specific for the narrative. I don't think I need to state that he also has an incredibly oversimplified, and also incorrect, description of late feudal and early capitalist class struggle. Also very funny that no one single group is able to do a power grab. Have you ever read any work on feudal or early capitalist class relations? It's clear as day he's going to try to juxtapose this with ooh, evil Jewy Soviets cooing and stealing power from the Orthodox saviors of Russia. Although I'm sure he isn't anti-Semitic, but that's where that talking point originated from. If you want an actually scientific analysis of the process, The Origin of Capitalism by Ellen Wood is a great place to start. His overview of quote-unquote Eastern monarchies was decent enough, so I won't comment.
Spurred on by fair legal systems and property rights on intellectual property, people can now profit off of discovering new inventions and processes without fear of someone robbing them of their ideas.
Do I really need to say anything here? Ever heard of the light bulb, my guy? He then goes on to talk about the relatively low level of industrialization of Tsarist Russia and the incredible backwardness of their economy.
Protests erupted in Petrograd, soldiers began a mutiny, and Vladimir Lenin, the exiled head of the Communist Bolshevik Party, was smuggled into the country by the Germans, who had hoped would cause further internal conflict, which it did.
Not entirely inaccurate, but smuggled in by the Germans makes it seem like a German conspiracy. If you actually look into the history, it was incredibly difficult to convince the Germans to allow transit to some revolutionaries via sealed train through their land. It was less Germany planning things behind the curtain, and more the revolutionaries pulling basically all the strings and connections they had to make it happen, to transit through Germany before the Germans changed their minds, as they had their own revolutionary movement that they were afraid of, and practically all the revolutionaries on board, including Lenin, spoke German.
The country quickly became divided between the provisional government, held by the less radical revolutionaries, and the much more organized and radical communist Bolsheviks. Eventually, the country broke into a bloody and grueling 3-year-long civil war. By the end, Russia was in ruins, and the communists, under the command of Lenin, had taken and cemented control of the country, formally creating the Soviet Union shortly after.
I know he does this for brevity's sake, but this is just wrong. The civil war wasn't between the provisional government and the Bolsheviks. The number of factions, external armies, invasion, and sabotage present was astronomical, and gross oversimplification like this just defeats the purpose of trying to educate. If you want a proper look into the Russian Revolution, Edward Carr's 3-volume series is excellent. Otherwise, a decent overview is October, the story of the Russian Revolution by China Miéville.
He believed a constant battle between capitalism and workers would ultimately result in a revolution, for which the working class would seize the means of production and build a classless society where private property would be abolished and everyone would work for the common good.
Again, oversimplification to the point of being wrong. Socialism, which is what the Soviets were building, was from each according to their ability to each according to their work. Communism, the next stage of development, which was centuries away, was from each according to their ability to each according to their need. Communism can only occur internationally in post-scarcity, and is a natural developmental step. Socialism doesn't require those caveats and is an active process of construction. Lenin's statement of the revolution is a great read on this, as well as Engels' principles of communism.
However, the party that took control, the Bolsheviks, were not a broad coalition of the working and lower class like the Western revolutions, but rather a small group of highly radicalized and organized Marxists. Therefore, there was no built-in mechanism to stop them from becoming tyrannical themselves like there had been in the West.
What did I say? I told you to pull this shit, didn't I? Alright, firstly, no, the Bolsheviks were a widely popular party with a massive base amongst the industrial proletariat of Russia. Their inroads into developing connections with the peasantry began later, but was nonetheless present and ever-growing. Even prior to the revolution, Lenin was known all over Europe. Just so people remember, this guy claims there were built-in mechanisms to prevent tyranny in the West, which were missing in the Bolsheviks supposedly. He conveniently misses that at this time, all of Europe was either a monarchy, a fascist dictatorship, or had an incredibly troubling and growing fascist problem. Today, literally every single Western quote-unquote democracy is a dictatorship of the ruling class, a dictatorship of capital. The ideology of these people always astounds me, and their claim to objectivity is even worse.
The first thing the Bolsheviks did was make themselves into a new class of political elites, much the same as the ones they had destroyed in the revolution.
You need to substantiate this argument, my guy. Political elites is a cute term to throw around, but is without much substance. Pelosi is a political elite. She directly owns capital, participates in the dictatorship of capital, and is at the direct levers of power. That's an actual political elite, one with substantially different relations to the means of production and the power to act on that to the benefit of her and her class. Lenin, Sverdlov, Kalinin, Molotov, etc. owned no capital, no land, no means of production of any kind, and were rigidly bound to both party as well as council democratic centralism. If you instead mean that they were visible officials in a system, then no shit, any hierarchical system has members at different levels. Furthermore, he says, the same as those they destroyed in the revolution. Dude, they couldn't be further from. Aristocrats, oil barons, giants of industry, massive landowners, etc. Those were the people who were destroyed in the revolution. This is just plain wrong. He's either lying on purpose or he's ignorant. Throwing scary terminology around devoid of substance to confirm preconceived biases isn't a proper argument.
They disallowed anyone who disagreed with them from joining the party,
like literally every party or political organization out there. This is generally such a stupid point, but he's trying some cringe scare tactic. There's literally nothing weird about this. Political organizations have political platforms. If you don't agree with the political platform, you logically can't join. You can't run on a communist platform in the US. There are both legal and other barriers to that. You can't even be explicitly anti-capitalist in the US without a whole host of political, social, professional, and other consequences. Explicitly anti-capitalist literature is incredibly hard to get published without severe defanging in the US and the West in general. And if it wasn't for the internet, it'd be a real pain getting a hold of any of this in the first place. Threaten capital in any capacity in any republic or parliamentary system and see how far you get, if you're not outright assassinated or overthrown like Allende, Mossadegh, etc. Furthermore, there was more disagreement and diversity of opinion in the Bolshevik party than there ever has been in both the Republican and Democratic parties combined, but again he would have known that if he decided to actually research the topic he's making a 30-minute video on.
And sought to institute their socialist utopia through force.
Institute their socialist utopia through force. Alright, this guy's just an idiot, as well as a propagandist, it seems. Firstly, every political program to ever exist has been imposed by force, and also is unironically propaganda. You need to look up the definition of the word, my guy. Socialism is the only one that has had some semblance of popularity and democratic participation, the perfect examples being the Soviet or Cuban constitutions. That's why the CIA and all their tentacles abroad have to try their hardest to invade, sabotage, rig elections, assassinate revolutionaries, sanction socialist countries, etc, etc. Read up on Operation Gladio. Read up on what happened in Chile or Greece. Fuck, just pick up a book, please. I swear to God, having little knowledge on shit is even more dangerous than being ignorant because you come off like this guy. Secondly, socialism is and was never utopian. There's an entire school of socialism rejected by Marxists termed utopian socialism. Engels even had a stupidly popular essay on it titled Socialism Utopian and Scientific, in which he breaks this down bit by bit. TLDR, to call any attempt at socialism utopian is nothing more than an attempt to mask one's own ignorance with some nonsense platitude. His subsequent overview of war communism and the NEP is wholly insufficient for a video claiming to discuss the Soviet economy, but it's alright since I'm assuming he's going to get to the meat of the video elsewhere. Hopefully.
In 1924, Lenin died of a stroke, and shortly after, Stalin took control as head of the Communist Party.
Oh boy, there's that music again.
In 1928, the first of the 5-year plans was set into motion, which nationalized all production once again. By this point, the entire Soviet economy was entirely commanded from above.
This is something you hear a lot, but there's no reality to. The Soviet economy wasn't entirely controlled from above. There was a complex interlinking system of economic planning that spanned from enterprise committees all the way to the Planning Commission, the Gosplan as it was referred to, with several rounds of discussion, amendments, and changes before a final vote on the economic plan. A good introductory video on this is How Did Gosplan Appear from Prime Numbers. Even in the most anti-communist of so-called research, you can see these notes and amendments being mentioned. Hilariously, and this would be evident if the guy did any semblance of research, the interlinking and mutually cooperative system between enterprises and the Central Commission is plainly described even in official reports to Congress, with an example being from the Joint Economic Committee titled Comparisons of the United States and Soviet Economies. It always amazes me how these types lie with such ease on things that are relatively easy to fact-check.
Meaning that every input and every output from every factory, every farm, every enterprise, every store, every price, all aspects of the Soviet economy was dictated by the government.
Lying again, but we've already mentioned that. The very first draft of an economic plan is a rough draft, drawn up by regional committees and central political organs to see exactly what is needed on a countrywide scale. Someone in an enterprise in Vladivostok doesn't know about, for example, the state of electricity generation from dams in the Caspian Sea, so obviously this original rough draft will be a bird's eye view from regional authorities. Funnily enough, even this rough draft relies on mountains of data sent from enterprises all over, so even from the very beginning the image he's painting is wrong. Unless he's being super pedantic, meaning since in the end the official bodies that put the plan in place are government bodies, hence technically it's the government doing all this, but that's playing with words with the intention of pushing people into a single opinion that you want to impart, which is equally shitty. Also, prices were planned. Yeah, so? It's a planned economy. Of course, they won't leave prices up to the market because there is no market on a nationwide basis. If he thinks planning prices is a bad idea, then he's going down the economic calculation problem angle, and I've already made a video on that here.
Stalin and the innermost party officials in the Politburo would decide the general direction of the economy, then through a series of government agencies an extremely intricate and detailed plan would be laid out. After a series of minor negotiations with managers of the individual farms and factories, the 5-year plan was put into law.
Do you hear the ideologically charged language here? Extremely intricate and detailed plans. From the top, minor negotiations at the bottom. My God, you're lying to people. Either that or you're supremely ignorant of what you're discussing. What could I expect from someone that wrote input with an M? Planning commissions took months, if not years, to draw this stuff up. If it was all from above, it would have been a done deal right away. There were literally dozens of revision cycles for plans. You're trying to push an image that just isn't true to suit your ideological biases. If you're interested in an overview of how exactly enterprises took part, take a look at Mick Costello's worker participation in the Soviet Union. If you want an actually deep dive about this particular era he's discussing, check out Chapter 8 titled Planned Production for Community Consumption in Webb's Soviet Communism and New Civilization. Notice how I actually give you sources to go and check out, unlike our friend here. Some of the sources he uses, like Why Nations Fall, barely cover the USSR, and when they do, reproduce such outdated misconceptions, and use no footnotes by the way, while outright admitting to ignoring research that reflects positively on the USSR, instead only referring to its existence in a single sentence deep in the bibliography. The other works cited also present far more nuanced pictures than this video I'm subjecting you to. After this, he rightly states that the first 5-year plan was an absolute necessity for industrialization, and was the only reason the USSR defeated the Nazis. He starts touching on collectivization by saying this.
In 1928, roughly 85% of the entire Soviet population was rural peasants whose backward, traditional way of doing things caused farming output to be very unproductive. Taxation of these small, scattered village communes was also notoriously inefficient. Stalin's way to deal with these problems was to force all the peasant farmers onto state-run or communal farms, which lumped hundreds or thousands together to work for the state.
To say that all peasants were forced is to lie. Many of the small peasantry were motivated by class struggle against wealthier peasants and enthusiastic about joining collective farms, having done so even without input from the top at times. In fact, all over the USSR, this pattern was being repeated, and rather than it being a diktat from above, it was the Soviet government playing catch-up with a chaotic and nuanced movement that was already ongoing. This is even referenced by Stalin and others during the era. For example, you can see Stalin's article in Pravda titled Dizzy with Success. Kulaks, wealthy peasants who bought up or took over land during the NEP period, were notoriously against collectivization, and their minority perspective is the only one centered on in popular Western anti-communist discourse. The movement was incredibly nuanced, and there was opposition at different levels, but it's very disappointing to see the low level of research in this video. Further reading on this topic is Mark Tauger's Stalin, Soviet Agriculture and Collectivization, and Soviet Peasants and Collectivization 1930 to 1939.
However, the inefficiencies were further exacerbated by the lack of incentives since farmers' output had no bearing on how much they were paid.
This is also nonsense. Collective farms sold output at fixed prices to the state and got bonuses for exceeding quotas. Plus, there were local small-scale markets for sale of other agricultural output not sold to the state. Collective farm workers were paid according to the quantity and quality of their work. The payment systems changed several times, but the core, from each according to their ability to each according to their work, was never violated. Again, this is just an outright lie.
In a capitalist society, you have total freedom to change your job and work anywhere else that will hire you.
Not true. There are several barriers to employment, and freedom of movement of labor only occurs when it benefits capital, but go on.
If you work smarter or harder or longer, you provide extra benefits to your employer. Not wanting to risk losing you to another employer, they will reward you with increased pay or benefits. Thus, there is a built-in incentive toward doing more of your job or better.
I don't even need to comment on this. How many people listening right now have worked themselves to the bone at some job, only for them to get no raise but more responsibilities, or even worse, having some manager over you be the guy that gets the raise on the back of your work? One of the largest subreddits that exist, anti-work, literally exploded because of shit like this. This is the usual nonsense absolutely disconnected from reality, but you hear parroted because it sounds good. This has even been empirically proven. In the US, wages have been stagnant since the 70s, despite skyrocketing productivity. This is a pattern all across the Western industrialized world.
In the communist Soviet Union, there was little if any incentive to do so, since your wage was almost always locked to a specific rate. Even when later attempts to provide more incentives were rolled out by the government, the extra money workers would receive would be of little use.
More nonsense. Again, workers were paid according to their work. The incentives nonsense has been debunked time and time again. Soviet enterprises were just as efficient, if not more efficient, than Western ones, depending on which research you're looking at. Soviet worker productivity was similar to that of workers in Western industrialized countries. Management efficiency, use of inputs, quality of outputs, all these are things you hear negative things about, but reality paints a different picture.
Since the Soviet economy was dictated from above, to keep the population content, prices were fixed and kept low. Output and prices were therefore not correlated with one another like they are in capitalist societies. That meant that the need for goods at prices set was much greater than the actual production of those items.
Huge simplification, and also kind of wrong, unsurprisingly. I love he doesn't specify at all, as if to paint an image of shortages of every single commodity. My guy, the country wouldn't have survived for nearly a century if that were the case. Firstly, this "to keep the people content" is such a stupid thing to say. Just because your government couldn't give a shit less if you live or die doesn't mean every other government out there is the same. They set prices out of commitment to socialism and every single person's right to the basic staples of life, not out of some Machiavellian scheme to control people. This was a political commitment that's missing from almost all imperial core countries, and that's why food banks are stretched thin from the US to Britain. It's objectively a good thing that output and prices for staples aren't linked like in capitalist market economies. That's how you avoid 1 in 6 children living in food insecure households like in the US. For luxury goods, yeah, the prices were usually higher and there was a relatively lower amount of them for several reasons, prime amongst them being the unending economic warfare and sanctioning of the Soviet economy from the rest of the world, as well as the continuous attempts at cutting it off from basically every source of raw material, as well as technically finished good.
This meant that items were almost always out of stock, and when they weren't, they would quickly sell out.
There were only 3 periods in USSR history with major shortages. The very inception of the Union, which had significant market relations until the 1928-33 period, World War II, and the very end of the USSR when they had transitioned away from socialism into market mechanisms, the very thing this guy is lauding. Notice how all these are periods of absolute turmoil which unsurprisingly disrupt supply chains and result in shortages. COVID did basically just that for the entire capitalist economy. But all of a sudden, if I bring that up, people like this guy will start calling for nuance. It's just also disingenuous. Luxury goods are another discussion, but arguably can be the only valid argument for shortages, which frankly I couldn't give a damn about. I'd rather people have free education and healthcare than Funko Pops or garbage overpriced repair locked phones, but that's just me. It's always good to remember that the point of the socialist system was to maximize living standards equally, rather than simply providing luxury goods to the absolute top. Undue overproduction isn't a good thing, especially with all the waste produced. That aside though, under capitalism there's plenty of limitations on luxury goods too, it's just that those that can't afford them don't notice. To these types, it doesn't matter if kids go hungry, as long as the Louis Vuitton store is always stocked.
This, along with the fact that the heavy industry was persistently emphasized more than the consumer goods manufacturing, and what you're left with is the inability to make use of any of the extra money afforded to you for doing a better job. Thus, incentives in the Soviet Union did not function well and per-person productivity suffered.
The emphasis on heavy industry was something imposed on the USSR by the outside world, and many debates internally were had over this. If socialism were allowed to develop on its own without external threat, then of course plenty of emphasis would be thrown on light industry and consumer goods. But without hydroelectric plants and tanks, you wouldn't have a country to consume within in the first place. Regardless, the efficiency meme is just that, a meme. It isn't true, and the research is clear on this. The only industry that truly worked below its total potential was agriculture, and this is an incredibly nuanced topic that can't be summed up simply as, oh, socialism messed it up. Even modern Russia faces similar issues in that field, and they're as capitalist as can get. He goes on to give a very limp-handed compliment to the USSR concerning its eye-popping growth of the 5-year plans. Seriously, it's like pulling teeth for him. I'm sure had any capitalist country posted half Soviet figures, this guy wouldn't be able to contain himself. Regardless, he claims that this growth was of, and I quote, low quality, without any source or example. Afterwards, it's the usual trifecta of anti-Soviet nonsense. Managers would game the system to underachieve, supply lines and inputs were bad, and most workers just sat around doing nothing. I've covered this nonsense in the last video, so if you're interested, take a look here. The workers sat around doing nothing point is one of those anecdotal things you hear but has no real empirical basis. Like in every economic system, and most of all capitalism, have you ever walked into a corporate office? There are people who try to get away with doing as little work as possible. This isn't unique to socialism or capitalism. Of all the people I personally know who have lived, worked, and studied in the USSR, none of them have ever gotten that impression. In fact, they saw the inverse, that the Soviet people were actually quite hardworking. I don't like using anecdotal evidence though, so take that with a grain of salt. Furthermore, I'd rather 20 people be in a workplace with some of them slacking rather than 10 being overworked and 10 being unemployed or homeless. Just a side note, the way he presents this argument also is incredibly mechanical and even wrong at times, so I feel that he hasn't actually read the few sources he lists in the description.
Most of these incentive issues stemmed from another key issue, that of limited information. When planning out, in its entirety, an economy of an industrialized nation, what is needed to run things as efficiently as a market economy is complete and total information, for which the Soviet planners did not have. Unproductive and wasteful industries persisted as incentives were unable to be utilized by the planners to increase efficiency.
The limited information point I've covered in the previous video on the Soviet economy, but the LDR, this is a semi-valid point that is no longer valid in the era of modern computing. Had the USSR endured till now, they would have most likely adapted toward that direction as well. As for the information point, this is just a bad rehashing of the economic calculation problem, which I've covered previously as well.
The last and arguably most important failure of the Soviet economy was a lack of innovation. In the capitalist world, ever since property rights were established and maintained, there was an immense incentive to create a new invention or more productive manufacturing process because you could patent the idea and make a lot of money. Again, in the Soviet Union, with fixed wages, limited range of items to buy, and the fear of this in some way or another coming back to harm you, there lacked general incentives for Soviets to innovate.
A silly point, as Soviet patents existed too and were roughly equivalent in output to, for example, the US. Furthermore, let's not forget it was the USSR that launched us into the space age, so the point really doesn't stand. I made a video a long time ago on socialism and innovation, so check that out here. He reiterates the outdated Soviet economy is based on oil narrative after this, mentions importing machinery as a bad thing despite literally every single capitalist economy doing the same, and yet again also the fairly simplistic "it was the Soviet military that drained the economy" meme that has at least a few grams of truth to it, but again is completely devoid of nuance or mention for unending warmongering from NATO and the US. Now, get ready for the liberal thesis of the century.
However, the seeds of the Soviet economic collapse had been planted before the nation even existed. Unlike the revolutions in Western Europe and the United States and their slow march toward greater rights and freedoms, the Bolsheviks that took control were not a broad coalition and thus they became tyrannical. Left with unchecked power, they did not form new inclusive systems, but rather made new extractive ones with themselves at the top.
There really is nothing to say here. Read Lacerda's Liberalism, a Counterhistory, and educate yourself out of this brain rot.
Just like how the elites of the Russian Empire resisted the creative destruction of industrialization, so too did the elites of the Communist Party, as they resisted giving up any political or economic power that would have enabled these positive changes. This was because they knew doing so would reduce their personal power, wealth, and potentially even their lives.
Literally just projection. Stalin lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with Molotov and died with a modest savings account and a few clothes to his name. Likewise with Lenin, Guevara, Sankara, and many other revolutionaries. It's capitalist politicians in the West and their lackeys that monopolize entire sectors and serve only capital for their own personal gains. Party officials had no different relations to the means of production than regular Soviet people, unlike members of Congress in the US or any other political institution in the US, for example, American presidents. Lying really is second nature to liberals, isn't it?
But ultimately, the story of the Soviet economic system was one that warns against the perils of tyrannical governments that only care about self-preservation. The incredible growth of the Soviet Union early on was not about increasing the living standards of its people, but rather to protect those in power. Therefore, the Soviet Union's collapse was determined before it even became an official country.
He ends the video with this nonsense. Can you believe it? Some people watch my video and claim I'm more quote-unquote ideological than this guy. Hey, at least I don't pretend objectivity exists. Where are your sources for this, my guy? Kotkin, one of the most anti-communist historians to exist, himself admitted to the clear devotion these people had to socialism and their country. Absolute brain rot. If you really care about actually learning why the USSR was illegally dissolved from a political and economic lens, check out Kieran and Kenny's Socialism Betrayed. I made a partial transcript into a video previously, which you can see here. And that's the video. Garbage, I know. I do apologize. It's not that the USSR didn't have clear deficiencies. Every country does. In fact, Marxists are usually way harder on the inefficiencies of social systems than liberals ever have been. But the point is that you shouldn't have to lie or resort to stupid, bombastic, propagandistic nonsense to get a point across. And that's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you too. Hossein, Sarup Chapagain, Elijah Acuna, Jay Peterson, Amelia de Saint Martin, Daniel Figueroa, Comrade Adam, Banjo Bandit, Cram Trevino, EQ Fan 592, Tom, Michelle Camilleri, Blue J5, Razor Sharp, a commie named Lucas, Hassan the Syrian, Anna Kay, Michael Chorus, Hal Matyak, Scott Will, Rodrigo Rocha, Comrade Kova, Alan Falloon, Marta Dominguez, Mystery Kaplan, Ben Harrison, Billy the Shook, and Green Candle. Thanks for watching.